Hello, economics students. Today we're going to talk about trade barriers, also sometimes referred to as restrictions to trade. It's an important topic, it's a relevant topic, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to look at the different types of trade barriers, and the most common and obvious type of trade barrier is a tariff. And simply stated, a tariff is simply a tax that's levied on imported goods. You may look at this picture and you might recognize that motorcycle there is a Harley Davidson. I put this picture here on purpose. Harley Davidson back in the 1970s entered into some hard times. It was the last remaining American motorcycle manufacturing company. We had in the United States lots of different companies manufacturing motorcycles. But after World War II, most of those companies fell on hard times, and Harley Davidson was the sole remaining producer of motorcycles in the United States. But by the late 1970s, the bikes that they were making were overpriced, and they weren't considered particularly competitive from a performance standpoint either with the motorcycles that were coming out of particularly Japan, but also Germany. This was when Hondas and Suzukis and Yamaha motorcycles were really hitting the American market very aggressively, much to the detriment of Harley Davidson. So in the 1980s, roughly about 1980, the United States passed a law which applied a significant tariff of about 20% on motorcycles that were made in Japan. And the purpose of this tariff was frankly just to save Harley Davidson from going bankrupt. All of a sudden, Japanese motorcycles were 20% more expensive with that 20% tariff applied to them, and it gave Harley Davidson some breathing room to modernize their manufacturing facilities and frankly make better motorcycles. Over the course of the 1980s, that tariff was phased out as Harley became more and more successful in modernizing their capital, their plant and equipment, and they really revived the brand and became the leading motorcycle in the United States from the aspect of sales of bicycles. So the tariff did save Harley Davidson. However, it also made motorcycles more expensive. If you wanted to buy a motorcycle with the Japanese prices being affected by the tariff, roughly 20%, you were going to have to pay significantly more for a motorcycle as a result of that tariff. So that's tariffs. It accomplished two things. It saved Harley Davidson, and it made motorcycles more expensive. Another type of trade barrier is a quota. A quota is a limit to the amount of a product that can be imported. And you may or may not recognize what this is in this picture. What you see there is sugarcane. And sugarcane is a farm commodity that has in the past oftentimes had a quota. So the United States does produce sugarcane. It's mainly grown in Florida and in Louisiana and in Texas. And there aren't that many sugarcane growers. And as you may guess, it's probably more expensive to grow sugarcane in the United States than it would be in certain countries that are of a more tropical nature, such as Haiti, for example. Sugarcane is a major product of Haiti, but with the quota, we're protecting the American growers. We will allow sugarcane to be imported into the United States from a country like Haiti or other, countries in Latin America. But once a certain amount of sugarcane has been imported, all imports come to a stop. And now the remaining sugarcane production for the United States for the rest of that year is going to be from American producers. So this is a way to protect American producers from foreign competition. And it does ensure that we'll have sugarcane growers in the United States. But guess what? It also makes sugar more expensive for you, the consumer. We're paying more for our sugar as a result of this quota. And anything that's made with sugar, whether you're going to a restaurant or whatever, is going to be more expensive for you because of the quota that's helping really just a small handful of American farmers. The next kind of trade barrier would be subsidies, and this is not quite as obvious a trade barrier. It's a guaranteed price given to domestic producers. Okay, so let's say what you have here is a rice grower, by the way. Rice is grown predominantly in Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and California. I'm not sure where this particular picture was taken. Excuse me. But this is a rice grower. United States cannot produce rice oftentimes at the global market price. Farmers in the United States will go out of business if they have to produce at the global market price. So the United States has guaranteed American producers a certain level, a minimum price for their product per bushel or whatever unit you sell rice in. So let's say that the global market price for rice is $100 per bushel. I have no idea what it is, but let's say it's $100 per bushel. If that's the global price, but an American farmer requires $120 per bushel in order to cover all of his expenses and to survive in that business, the United States could put a subsidy to guarantee the farmer $120 per bushel, even though the global price is $100. What does that do? Again, it's going to raise the price somewhat of your rice, not directly, but it's going to cause your tax dollars to go towards supporting this small number of rice growers in the United States so they can continue to grow rice. You'll still pay the same amount of price for rice at the grocery store. The tariff does not, the subsidy won't affect the price that you pay at the grocery store, but what it does do is redirect your tax dollars from things like, construction of roads or bridges or national defense or, environmental protections, and instead it sends those tax dollars to a small handful of farmers who are growing rice to keep them in the business. So that's a subsidy. And the last type of trade barrier is even less obvious than a subsidy, and that would be product standards. So let me tell you what we're talking about here. This could be environmental standards. So, for example, we may put up a law that says that every widget that is sold in the United States must be made of 50% recyclable materials, or something like that. Or we might say that every automobile that's sold in the United States must have a catalytic converter that meets certain standards, certain environmental standards. The catalytic converter is something that helps to make the emissions from a car less toxic. So we might have that kind of a standard there. And so anyone who wants to sell a widget or an automobile in the United States will have to meet that environmental standard. Now, Japan, where of course we import a lot of cars from, they may say, hey, we have catalytic converters that are just as good as yours, they just are made differently, but our cars do not emit any more toxic emissions than American-made cars. Why should we have to use specifically your standards to meet the environmental requirements when we can do it equally as well without having to use the exact same products or processes that the United States does? They might view our environmental standards on a car to be a barrier to trade, which makes their cars more expensive. Safety standards would be another thing, kind of similar deal. We might say that, for example, we're not going to import things that are made in factories that don't meet certain minimum safety requirements. Something that's made in Bangladesh, for example, might not meet the same kind of safety standards that we would have companies meet in the United States. So we might say, in order for you to be able to export something to the United States, you have to meet minimal safety standards, or we're not going to let your product in. Okay, that would be viewed by the Bangladeshis as a barrier to trade, to their ability to compete with America. Labor standards would be another possibility. We might have a rule that says we will not allow imports of goods and services which are made by child labor. Okay, and that certainly is an understandable thing to do. Again, however, foreign countries might object to that, saying, hey, we have to have 14-year-old girls making these products because otherwise their families are going to starve. So the United States once had child labor. We need child labor to get our feet on the ground industrially as well. We won't, but the United States may not buy that argument and say, hey, we're not going to allow you to export to our country if it's made by children. And finally, product quality. Yeah, I don't know if anyone speaks good German that's listening to this, but what you see here is the German Reinheitsgebot, which is the German word for purity law, the German purity law. And it says here in German, if I translate, it says, we desire that all towns and markets in the land will make beer only from barley and hops and water. In other words, you cannot have any other additives in the beer. You can't have beer made with corn or rice. It must be barley. This is the German purity law. And American beer manufacturers, as well as other European manufacturers of beer, always viewed the German purity law as a barrier to trade. It kept American beer manufacturers or British beer manufacturers from being able to sell their product as beer in Germany. Kind of a little funny side story. We have sold American beer in Germany, but we, in the past, were not allowed to call it beer. It had to be called a malt beverage because we added corn or rice into our beer. And that did not meet the German purity law. That purity law, by the way, is no longer in effect due to the European Union's rules. When Germany was a major member of the EU required that Germany open up their market to foreign manufacturers, even if their beer had things other than barley, hops, and water. But that was definitely a product standard that prevented imports and competition in Germany. Okay, let's look at a few arguments that would support the idea of having some barriers to trade. First of all, it does protect jobs. We saw that with the tariff on Harley-Davidson that helped out Harley-Davidson. We would have lost a lot of jobs up in Milwaukee area had Harley-Davidson gone out of business. National security is another legitimate argument. We don't want to be dependent on foreign countries for the component parts of, say, our jet fighters that we need or our tanks. We want to be able to produce things that we need for our national security here in the United States and maintain them without threat of overseas suppliers stopping the importation of those products. Infant industry protection. A lot of countries, particularly countries that are less developed countries, will put in barriers to trade so that they can get their feet on the ground industrially. They need to have barriers to trade so they can build their own industrial infrastructure up. And once they have an infrastructure in place, then they can do away with those barriers to trade. Economic diversity goes along with that. You want to have barriers to trade, perhaps, to diversify your economy and not be dependent on just one commodity. For example, we saw the film recently on Mongolia that was dependent on mining, one basic economic activity. They need to diversify their economy, so barriers to trade might help them to do that. And then the environmental protection argument. This picture is in Big Bend National Park. And about 100 miles from Big Bend National Park, there are a lot of manufacturing facilities in Mexico. And those manufacturing facilities produce a lot of pollution. And that pollution makes its way into the United States. We want to be able to protect not only our environment from overseas production, but the environment of the world, of the people in the country that is making the goods. And finally, retaliation. If someone puts a barrier to trade on us, someone slaps a tariff on some of our products, we might say then that we are justified in putting a barrier to trade on their products in retaliation. So you do see this happen every now and then. Let's look at a few arguments against trade barriers. They only benefit a few. Think about the farmers. Just a handful of sugar growers benefit from that quota on imported sugar at the expense of society at large, who has to pay higher prices for sugar. Along those lines, it does harm consumers. We pay more for goods and services when there are barriers to trade. The cleaner environment argument. I love this quote. Poverty is never kind to the environment. What that means is that countries that are desperately poor, they need to do whatever they can to ensure that their people are fed and housed. So they can't really focus on clean production. They need to first focus on food on the table, a roof over their head. Once they have that established, then they can focus on the environment. But until then, they really cannot focus on environmental issues. They have to focus on life itself. And finally, the morality. Is it moral for us to put a quota, a barrier to trade on sugar from Haiti. Haiti's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Is it moral to hurt those farmers at the benefit of just a few in the U.S.? That's it for today. Goodbye.